Greetings, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second of Dartmouth's presidential lecture series this summer. My name's Carol Folt, and I'm the provost at Dartmouth, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, President Jim Yong Kim. Now, he's not a person that needs much of an introduction to this to this group. We've all had a chance to get to know President Kim this last year. This time last year, he was starting off getting to know what sophomore summer is like, and now he's experiencing his second sophomore summer with all of us here. We all know him very well through his work as a physician, an anthropologist, as his work as a humanitarian, the co-founder of Partners in Health, and former director of the Department of HIV/AIDS at the World Health Organization. But we also know him as a pretty good performer in the Dartmouth Idol. We know him as a great fan on the sideline of virtually every activity that the students take place. We see him in the lecture halls and the talks that are being given across campus, and he's been also teaching in a lot of classes already this year. So I thought, well, what do you not know about him that I can tell you? So I started thinking, well, maybe you don't know what he did when he was a student. Unlike Dartmouth students, he didn't have a sophomore summer where you're studying languages and learning about antiquities and chemistry and government and economics. He had to go and make a living for his next year in school. So I asked him, what did you do in your sophomore summer? And so his sophomore summer, he had his first job was working at the Heinz ketchup factory in Muscatine, Iowa, where he was a very strong worker on the gravy making line. He stayed there for just a month, and then he took a different job where he was working as a waiter in a local restaurant. And I think we've decided that this is one of the key factors that has led him to be a president at Dartmouth. He says that he learned to do at that job a peach melba flambe while carrying a large tray of food and entertaining his customers all the time. So please welcome our multitasking president for this lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see all of you. First of all, I want to thank a group of people that we've been working with over the last year, the Higher Education Study Group. Many of them are here in the audience today. And with the Higher Education Study Group, we've been asking some very, very basic questions. When I came here, the question I asked was, what are we doing to 18 to 24-year-old minds? Part of it was that I've been reading some of the literature that suggested that 18 to 24-year-old minds are involved in much more intensive neuronal connection and formation than we'd ever thought before. In other words, the 18 to 24-year-old period is far more important and plastic in terms of creating new connections than we ever thought. But we felt that at the end of the year, we had to bring it together somehow. And this is my own very personal effort to take you through what we know about the developing mind and how that might have a direct impact on you sophomores who are here this summer. So I thought I'd start talking about what my own aspirations were at about this time. Now, this was, by the time I was a sophomore, I was forced to give up this aspiration. But for most of my childhood, I wanted to be a professional basketball player. 5'10" Korean kid from Iowa. It's a very rational choice that I was making to think that I was going to be able to join the NBA. But one of the great things about this job is that despite the fact that I never made it as an athlete, I'm now like sort of the owner, president of 34 sports teams, right? And so I get to go to practices. I actually this year got to scrimmage with both the women's volleyball and the women's basketball team. The men's basketball team even lets me shoot the ball a few times. The football team lets me throw, and I threw out the first pitch. This is just great. And my own sense was that, as I wanted to be an athlete when I was a kid, my own sense was that my own son, Thomas, who's 10 years old, who does a lot of these things with me, my own sense is that Thomas was really developing a better image of his father, really looking up to me because, I get to go and do the pep talk before the football game. Well, this is what Thomas thinks of my own efforts. Now, you can see here, this is Diego, one of our great linebackers. He noticed it and he thought that was very funny that Thomas was doing that. And I told Thomas after I saw this picture, I said, Thomas, I might show this to students and some audience. He said, Dad, what about the reputation? And I said, oh, don't worry, Thomas. I think my reputation will be fine if I show this picture. And he said, no, not your reputation, my reputation. Well, one of the things that we know about aspirations is that you gotta have very high ones, and your aspirations should be high from the very beginning. So every day that I'm here as president talking with all of you as students, you should know that I'm constantly thinking about what I tell Thomas. And interestingly, the things that I've learned this year about the developing mind has actually changed the way I talk to Thomas about things. Things we understand about the importance of persistence, things we understand about not making conclusions too early about the nature of a person's talent. So this is the Rockefeller Leadership Fellows. And if you look at this particular really outstanding group of young people, Ben Campbell down here on the left was a mentee of mine, and he's now off working on outcomes measurement for global health in a group that's led by a classmate of mine out in Seattle. Over on the right, JR was a proud member of the Alpha Delta fraternity, AD, and now he's at law school. Next to him is Jessica Guthrie, who got one of the most coveted positions now for graduates. She's doing Teach for America. Next to her is Matt Applegate, who's working on Wall Street. And in the top left corner is Will Shapiro. Will is now my presidential fellow, and I want to thank him in this setting for doing a huge part of the research that led to this particular talk. Now, the interesting thing is, as you talk to the people who are selecting these young people, you might think that every single one of the things that they're doing had a completely different set of things they were looking for. The striking thing was actually how similar they are. If you look at Teach for America probably does this as well as anybody. They have 7 traits that they're looking for. And not only do they have 7 traits that they're looking for, they actually measure those traits in their applicants. Moreover, they follow the development of those traits as you are teaching in the schools. And if they find that one or another of those traits are actually more correlated to success than the other, then they reweight those traits in looking at the next group of people who might be coming in. So there is a lot of work being done these days on looking for the kinds of traits, what I would call habits of the mind, different skill sets, of course, but habits of the mind more importantly in what they're looking for in individual people. So what is a habit of the mind? The reason I was so attracted to this particular way of thinking about skills, this particular way of thinking about the attributes of students, is that they've now in psychology been working very hard to continually put a finer point. It's not just discipline or the ability to finish a task. The notion of persistence is extremely important. And persistence now is the focus of a lot of different work. If you have some time this summer, the popularization of the importance of persistence was written by Malcolm Gladwell in a book called Outliers. Creativity, independence, empathy, managing impulsivity, taking responsible risks, metacognition, thinking about thinking. There are more of them, but with each of them, they're trying to put a finer point on it. What is it? Can it be studied? Are there underlying neurophysiological correlates of these qualities? This is a list of 16 of them. I like this particular list because it points out things that you wouldn't think about. Like, look at the one here on the top right, and I'll read it for you. Responding with wonderment and awe. Now you think, is that just kind of a corny way of talking about the life and skills? I actually think what they mean here is taking the anti-cynicism pill. Cynicism has grown. We know that. Young people are more cynical these days, and partly, the reasons for that might be varied. But a lot of people agree that using different kinds of measures, young people are a little bit more cynical. But here's my experience with cynicism. Tracy Kidder, who wrote that great book on about Paul Farmer that included some of the work we did at Partners in Health. Tracy is one of the great writers living today. And Tracy followed us all over the world and listened to us tell him, but you know, Tracy, we can do this. We can change the way people treat MDR, drug-resistant TB. We can change the way people think about HIV. And he kept coming up with more or less cynical ways of saying, no, come on, that's not possible. You can't possibly. Well, how can you even think that that's possible? After about a year of doing this, he looked at me and he said, well, Jim, I guess what I realized is that cynicism is the last refuge of the coward. Responding with wonderment and awe to new information, I think, is really important. But how do we think about it? It's not just about making you naive. It's not making you react joyfully or artificially to different kinds of information. I think that this is worth study. You know, cynicism is also probably correlated with a part of the brain. We couldn't find much literature on that. But what does that mean? And what kinds of experiences would it shut you off to if you were overly cynical? Now, one of the things that is important then with these habits of the mind is you have to ask ourselves questions. Are the habits teachable? Are they critical for your lives? Why are these habits important to me? And you know, I'm taking a step and taking my own risk. I'm getting into areas in which I'm not a specialist. I'm not a brain scientist. I'm not a social psychologist. But this kind of information made a lot of sense to me as I thought about what I would want to tell a group of sophomores in the sophomore summer. And finally, this is the most important question. This is a very important period in your lives. A lot of things come together in the sophomore summer. Somebody explained to me the other day what the X factor is and how it comes together in the sophomore summer. That's not what I'm talking about. Right? What I'm talking about is you're halfway through, and you have a chance now to consciously think about the habits of your own mind and what you can do to prepare yourself for great success in whatever you choose to do, whether it's graduate school, whether you want to write a dissertation on Shakespeare, whether you want to work in an investment bank. It's just striking to me how many of these habits are things that everybody looking to employ or admit graduates are looking for. So, very interesting study. I'm actually not quite sure where it was done, but the professors who did this study were all Dartmouth professors when they did the study. I suspect this was Dartmouth students, although it's not clear. What they did was they did MRIs before freshmen started school, and then about 6 months and a year later. And these are complicated diagrams. The point of the study, and the authors were Abigail Baird and her colleagues, who's left Dartmouth and is now at Vassar, but they were a very important group here. And it's just a small study of 19 college freshmen beginning fall term, and then 6 months later, and then a year later. What it showed was that there was a very significant increase in what they call voxel intensity. And they go into depth about thinking about what that means. Their conclusion is that these are white matter changes. So you're actually changing the structure of your brain in a very short period of time. Their conclusion was that young people with very much actively developing brains are exposed to a completely different social context, and that social pressure, understanding the new situation, understanding how to deal with it, actually creates new neuronal connections. And so the point is, even at this stage, you are actively making new neuronal connections, and it's partly up to you to choose what kind of connections you want to make. Now, hearing that there was this study going on and that others had been studying brains through functional MRI, I volunteered. And I said, you know, if freshman brains are changing that much, if first-year student brains are changing that much in their exposure to Dartmouth College, maybe my brain will change too. So I talked to a person at Massachusetts Mental Health Center who was a Dartmouth 82 graduate. And so we decided to do a MRI of my brain before coming to Dartmouth and after I got here. So this is my brain before coming to Dartmouth. You can tell there's, red is kind of indicative of stress. So you can tell there's kind of a deep, kind of a crimson hue to this brain right prior to me coming to Dartmouth. And this is the change over time. So bleeding green is actually a physiological phenomenon that you can see. No, but one of the things that that you might ask of these kinds of studies is, surely, I mean, I'm sure we've advanced a lot, but things like human empathy, those transcend human physiology. Those are parts of the human soul that you can't study. Well, in fact, they are studying them. And in fact, this particular set of MRIs is very closely correlated to the notion that you can diagram, you can watch empathy, and you can see it happening on a functional MRI in front of you. So this is a study from Jean Dessetti and colleagues at the University of Washington that was done in 2004. And the subjects were given a series of photographs where different things were happening to body parts, and some of them very, very painful. The results showed that perceiving and assessing painful situations in others was associated with significant bilateral changes in activity in several regions. And this is a hotly debated topic, but there is this notion that when you see others experiencing something like a painful situation, you actually reactivate the part in your brain. You have a mirror impact, and that's actually the foundation of empathy. So they've also studied this in monkeys, and it turns out that neurons in monkeys fire not only when they themselves perform an action, but also when they watch another monkey do the same thing. So it's just the beginnings, but what it suggests to me is that we're getting more and more and more precise about finding the neurophysiological basis of things as seemingly non-corporeal, seemingly related to the soul, as empathy. Now, this is another study that looked at male subjects aged 8 to 27. This was done by Ellen Greimel and her associates at the University Hospital in Aachen, Germany. And it looked at changes over time of empathy centers. And it's a complicated study. Suffice it to say that what it showed was that over time, your ability to feel empathic can grow. Now, why is it important to have your ability to be empathic grow over time? Well, there's a great group of, as you guys all know, psychology and brain science people here. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been assisted quite a bit by people like David Bucci and Todd Heatherton. And this is from a paper that Professor Heatherton is working on right now. Empathy is critical because we are fundamentally social beings. Let me put it in terms of anthropology. What we seem to see 20, 30,000 years back in the anthropological record is that the advantage that human beings had is very likely to have been cooperation, and I think moreover empathy. We have found the bones of very old people that's tens of thousands of years old that were clearly inflicted with an enormous handicap. But even in those days, when conditions were very difficult, they kept this person alive for a very long time, didn't just abandon this person. I would argue that human beings' ability to feel empathy is critical for many things. Professor Heatherton talks about 4 components of the social brain, and you all have it. And in order to be competent socially, you need to have a sense of yourself. You need to have a theory of mind, meaning you have to understand that other people have their own mind and are developing independent observations and evaluations of you. You need to use that information to detect threats, and you need to be able to regulate and change your behavior in response. Now, I've had lots of people tell me that empathy among young people is going down. And there are controversial studies that suggest that the ability of our young people to feel empathy is going down with a curve that looks, very convincing like that. Well, in speaking with professors in the psychology and brain science department, we know that this information is very controversial. And I would argue that this information is also very much counter to my own experience. This was 2 of our people, Kimberly Gagnon from Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and Kurt Reinhardt, also Dr. Kurt Reinhardt from Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in Hench, a small town outside of Haiti, where I've been many times working on a Partners in Health project. You know, there's no question that there's been a tremendous growth in you students' compassion for others, in my view. Your interest in thinking about the lives of Africans. Somehow, the closeness that this community feels with disasters that are happening far off places seems to belie to me the notion that empathy is going down. But I don't think it's enough just to pat ourselves in the back by saying there's a growth of interest in, service, and there's extraordinary interest in Teach for America, medical schools reporting that people are interested in global health. I don't think that's enough. And I think that it's important to use your empathy muscle every day. Right? Now, is it possible to use your empathy muscle? Is it something that you develop? Well, Professor Heatherton argues that there is a reserve of the ability to feel empathy for others that you can actually develop over time. Now, I've had a unique and wonderful experience of actually being trained how to do that. Because as an anthropology grad student, you do something called ethnography, participant observation ethnography. And the whole point of ethnography is that you put yourself into a completely foreign situation. And you sit there and you suspend all of your own assumptions about how the world works and what's normal and what's reasonable. And you work and work and work to try to understand how that particular group sees the world. And as you write about it, that's your thesis. That's the work of anthropology. My belief is that every one of you has to be in some form anthropologist. That's the world you're going out into. You're going out into a world where people have very different assumptions. And it happens here on campus as well. We have done a lot of work to increase the diversity of Dartmouth College, and we're one of the most diverse campuses around. But it's not going to help you if you only stay around the people who you're comfortable with. There is no question that having groups here on campus where you feel comfortable is really important. But also, think of it this way. It's not about just not hanging with your people. There's nothing simple about it. It's about finding ways to start here, developing your empathy muscles, which you'll use for the rest of your life. And I would argue that your empathy muscles can get flabby over time. So not only does empathy have a neurophysiological correlate, I believe with every fiber of my body that you can develop it, and moreover, that it's critically important for you to develop it. Why? Well, this is a picture of me in Peru in 1994. This was my second ethnographic experience. My first was to go back to Korea, learn a language I had forgotten completely after I came here at the age of 5. And I went back to Peru and learned another language, Spanish. More than anything else, though, I wanted to show you this picture to show that at one point in my life I actually did have hair. And ever since that time, this was 1994, right? I worked very, very hard to try to understand how Peruvian children in this case, but how Peruvians understood drug-resistant tuberculosis, how Peruvians understood the nature of social organizations and bureaucracies like the Peruvian Ministry of Health. Any of the higher order things that we have in this life, art, music, especially in the form of orchestras, universities and colleges like Dartmouth College, have their foundation, I would argue, at least at some point, in empathy. All right? So, empathy is an important habit of the mind. Empathy is something that I think is teachable. Empathy is something you have to work on developing again and again forever. And empathy is critical to your success later in life. Taking another person's idea, judging it to be insufficient, and stating your own opinion is something we teach you here. Right? And it's very important. You have to marry that skill with the ability to, at any time, just stop and really try to experience the world from the shoes of others. And if you do it well, the little thing on your functional MRI is going to light up brighter and brighter. Risk-taking. Risk-taking and managing impulsivity are two very important habits of the mind. And it turns out that we now know a lot more about the reward system for risk-taking than ever before. And this is a particular part of there's light up in the frontal cortex, but there's also in the middle of the brain there is something called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is really important in giving you a sense that you're going to get great reward from doing something. Now, that nucleus accumbens is regulated by your prefrontal cortex, right? Oh man, I'm gonna, sexual excitement lights up the nucleus accumbens. Food often lights up the nucleus accumbens. Thinking that you're going to reap huge financial reward, this has been studied. This is where this study comes from, lights up the nucleus accumbens. What keeps it in check so that you're not always taking risks is the prefrontal cortex. Not surprisingly, if you look at nucleus accumbens activity relative to orbital frontal cortex, now this is not, the orbital frontal cortex is involved somewhat in impulsivity in the perception of reward. But what you can see is in the middle graphs, in the gray, in adolescence, nucleus accumbens activity is relatively much higher than prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex activity. All of this to say that it seems that what happens over time is that without the development of your prefrontal cortex, the ability to think, to cognitively work through processes, so that not only do you see the rush of the possibility of great reward around any of these stimuli, but then you can also think about, well, wait a minute, maybe that's not such a great idea after all. This is what you develop over time, and I would argue that this is one of the most important struggles that happen right here on Dartmouth College campus. Incidentally, alcohol tends to shut down your prefrontal cortex, and alcohol tends to excite your nucleus accumbens. So things that you think seem really cool and that will bring you great reward when you're under the influence of alcohol are partly due to the fact that the relative control of these two centers is shifted with alcohol. Right? Now, why am I saying this to you? Look, there's a lot of risk-taking that happens in the evenings under the influence of alcohol. When we say that taking responsible risks is important, that's not what I'm talking about, right? This past spring, under the influence of alcohol, one particular person jumped from the top stair in the basement of a fraternity and landed on top of the pong table. The pong table broke and hit him in the head, knocked him out, and, in my view, almost killed him. Now, sitting at the top of the stair with his prefrontal cortex well suppressed, he must have thought that it would be a great idea to jump on top of that pong table, right? Now, again, I don't want to preach to you. I'm not. I want you to know that this is what happens. I want you also to know that excessive alcohol drinking actually makes you lose your cells in that area of the brain that is developing so rapidly here at Dartmouth College and is able to keep the nucleus accumbens in check. Now, this is all good, well and good in terms of the science. And in fact, I think you guys take a lot of great risks. Going up into the mountains, and we're about to, in a month or so, we're going to be welcoming the Trippies. Those, I think, are really, really important risks. It's really important to take risks. And here's what Jay Conger of Claremont McKenna College says about the importance of taking responsible risks. I quote, "A leader builds trust in the goals and demonstrates how these goals can be achieved. This is achieved through personal example, risk-taking, and unconventional expertise. These qualities are made to appear extraordinary by the leaders demonstrating a total dedication and commitment to the cause and vision, and by engaging in exemplary acts that are perceived by followers is involving great personal risk, cost, and energy." So I have experienced this, and I don't want to make this too much about me, but again, all I have really is my own experiences to share with you, to try to convince you that while on the one hand you manage impulsivity, you let your prefrontal cortex work, you also know what it means to take important risks that will benefit lots of different people. This is the 3x5 initiative. Some of you have heard of it. It was my own involvement in the World Health Organization. And what we did was we began thinking, this was in the summer of 2003. At that time, we knew that about 5 million people needed treatment for HIV disease in developing countries. About 100,000 people were on treatment. And what we feared was that if we didn't move very, very quickly to treat people, we were going to have massive die-offs that would profoundly affect the very core of many societies in Southern Africa. And moreover, the argument I kept making was if we let all of these people die without even trying to treat them, that act will morally define our generation. We will be known as a generation who did have access to drugs, life-saving drugs, yet because we thought it was too hard or too complicated, we let millions of people die. So when I got to the World Health Organization, we thought about what we could do. I brought over a gentleman named Don Berwick. Some of you who follow healthcare will know that he's recently been named as the new head of Medicare and Medicaid. I brought Don over to the World Health Organization, and I said, Don, what do we need to do? And he said, you got to set a target, you got to set an end date, and you got to push, push, push to get people to react. So that thereby came the 3x5 initiative. This was summer of 2003. And there had been a speech that the previous Director General of WHO gave that said, you know, about 3 million people should be on treatment by 2005. She said it in 2001, and she said it without really having a plan for getting there. So we said, hey, previous Director General already set the target, let's go after it. And so we started this huge movement, talked to everybody and said, we got to get to 3 million by 2005. This was one of the most controversial programs in the history of the World Health Organization. And what happened was immediately everyone began talking about risk. And I heard again and again and again, oh, what are you doing? This is crazy. It's so risky. And I didn't understand what was risky about it. Nobody was on treatment. We wanted to set a goal, and we wanted to push the world in a direction of saving lives. What they told me was, the risk is, if it fails, who will be blamed? I said, what do you mean? If it fails, somebody will be blamed, and I don't want to be blamed. Right? So I brashly said, okay, if we fail, I'll take the blame. I'll stand up and say it was my fault. You know, if we fail and I take the blame, I suspect I'm going to be able to feed my children and do okay in life. It's very important to take this risk because it's not about us. It's about the people waiting for treatment. So the way it turned out was I actually did end up taking the blame when we failed. We went from about 150,000 total, mostly in Brazil, maybe a little bit more, about 50,000 on treatment in Africa, to 1.5 million people on treatment by 2005. And I did what I said I'd do. I went on the air and I said, I take the blame. BBC did an interview and said, well, what do you say to those people who didn't get treatment? I said, well, we apologize. We could have worked harder. We could have done more. We apologize. And so I personally took the blame for everyone. And when I came back to the office at the World Health Organization, everybody in the office was furious at me. Because by that time, they had become convinced that no one was at fault, that no one should take the blame, that this risk was a risk worth taking. Look at the positive things that had happened. It turned out, though, that me actually taking the blame was really good, because everyone was ready to pounce on us and just attack us for setting a target and missing the target. But because I went out and blamed myself before anyone could do that, I started getting these notes from people all over the world saying, hey, Jim, brilliant strategy. Take the blame before they can blame you. Right? 5.5 million people are on treatment today. And we reached the target of 3 million by 2007. And so something that seemed risky for me, in the end, was not risky at all, in my view. So doing things for others that might then reflect negatively on you because it was a risk for you is a good thing. And that is something that is not just sort of looking at the possibility of great reward and letting your nucleus accumbens take over, but it's thinking hard about how to make the world a better place. So, how does this translate to you? I would argue that every single one of you are working with a theory of mind. In other words, you have a sense of how smart you are, how smart other people are, whether you can get smarter, what your capacity is. And I would argue that you have to think again about what your theory of mind is. You have to really critically assess your own theory of mind. And here's an example. So I just today was on the blog of Cal Newport, Dartmouth class of 2004, PhD in computer science from MIT, and he's written a lot about success in college. And he pointed me to, I didn't know about this study before, the work of Carol Dweck at Columbia University. And she looked at the mindset of students taking a general chemistry class. And there were two kinds of students. One were the fixed mindset students who believe that their intelligence is just a fixed trait. They worry about how clever they are. They don't want to take on challenges and make mistakes. They don't want their own relative lack of intelligence to be exposed. The second one was a growth mindset, where students think, no, it's something that you can develop. And here's the amazing thing. In Journal Personality and Social Psychology, they found that the students who had the fixed trait mindset of how brains work did poorly compared to the students who had the developing framework, the notion that you can improve all the time. Moreover, they showed that when one of the students got a bad grade, the ones who had the more fluid understanding of how people can improve were able to respond with a better grade the next time. So on a very practical level, and this is just the beginning, I want to stress that I'm just talking to you today about 3 habits of the mind. Our working group on higher education that's going to become much larger. We're going to be working with everybody on campus. Bruce Sacerdote is here today, has been one of our leaders. Tom Luxon is here in the audience today, another one of our leaders. Tom is here, right? I thought I saw him, yeah. We're going to continue to take this further. And we want you guys to know about all of this. Who knew that for general chemistry, the most important thing is to have the appropriate theory of mind as you go into it? So this is the beginning. We're going to continue to go forward. And I want you to know that I have a very clear motive behind doing this, because I still believe in this, all right? I talk about this all the time. People are sick of hearing me talk about it. But I think that in the convocation exercises in October of 1946, when John Sloan Dickey said to the students, "The world's troubles are your troubles, but since the troubles of the world come from the hearts of men, there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix." What we're doing here is trying to build better human beings, but it's a huge part of it is your responsibility. You have to be thinking in your own mind, these neural connections are being made all the time, depending on the inputs, depending on the stimuli, depending on the choices that I make. My mind is going to develop in this way, or any other kinds of ways. You always have a chance to do it again. What we're finding is that neuroplasticity extends to very late in life. Exercise in people in their 70s seems to create new neural connections, even at that age. There was an amazing study in that was done at the Hebrew Rehabilitation Center in Boston, where they took 80-year-olds through weight training regimens. That changed fundamentally their ability to carry out the activities of daily living. Now, I believe that that's what we do here at Dartmouth College. We are in the business of building the better human beings that can take on the world's troubles and make them better. But the really exciting thing for me in studying with people like Tom and Bruce and Dave Bucci and Todd Heatherton is that not only is there a scientific basis to these ideas and feelings, but we can systematically help you to develop those traits. You need to take your education into your hands right now. This is the time to do it. How are you doing with those 16 habits of the mind? Put them on your wall. Think about it. Your theory of mind affects your performance in chemistry class. It's very, very important to get in the right frame of mind, or an effective frame of mind for you as you do it. You've got 2 years before you're right here. It's plenty of time to develop habits of the mind. You're at the height of possibility in terms of developing great habits of the mind. This is a time when neuronal connections are being remade and remade with great speed. You come here with great attributes. You know, one of the professors pointed out to me that often you have people with different kinds of characteristics. You have one group with great analytic skills, and you have another group with great empathic skills. Well, we're lucky here at Dartmouth because we get to choose the ones who have both. You guys come in here, for the most part, with both of those skills, both of those traits. This is a really strong foundation. You all have a very strong foundation from which to build. You can build empathy muscles, persistence muscles, responding with wonderment and awe muscles, but you have to work at it every day, and it's worthwhile, and it never is going to end. You'll have to do this for the rest of your life. You know, I came here, stopped doing my work in developing countries, because I truly believed that by coming here and helping you develop your habits of the mind, that we together would have a much greater impact on the world than I ever could alone, or even with the small group that I worked with. Never forget the great words of Margaret Mead, a famous anthropologist who passed away some years ago. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed souls can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." The faculty and I am with you every step of the way to help you develop those habits of the mind that will allow you to take on the world in whatever way you want. And as you know, I'm willing to do just about anything to help you accomplish your goals. Thank you.
I need to make an announcement that I should have made at the start, and that is that if hopefully you have lots of questions, if you would just fill out your note cards and pass them to the side, they'll be transmitting them up here to me on this iPad so that I can ask them to President Kim. We already have some of them. There will also be a broadcast of the lecture online for people who would like to see it. And we're going to try to get to a number of the questions in the time that we have. We're also going to be looking, as Jim said, to all of you, to ways to really expand this lecture series, bring this kind of richness throughout the year and to the sophomore summer. A number of students are already having dinner tonight with quite a few faculty to talk about this, so we're really going to be looking to you for your input. So put those kind of suggestions forward as well. So I'll start with one question, Jim. You talked about habits of the mind, and I loved your example of, as an anthropologist, learning empathy. That was really wonderfully vivid. And I think you talked about habits of the mind, risk-taking as a doctor. As a president, what habits of the mind do you feel are particularly important or that you've been intentionally focusing on?
Yeah, I think the list of habits of the mind for president are about 25,000 and not just 16. I think one of the things that happens in institutions of higher education is that we tend to become very conservative, especially because we have the greatest product on the face of the earth. There is no question in my mind that the American college and university system is by far the best in the world. And so it's hard to tackle something like the great 240-year-old institution of Dartmouth and talk about we need to take some risks. We need to really think about how we can make ourselves even better. But the ability to withstand criticism to persist in the face of criticism over a kind of risk-taking that I think is really important is maybe what I found is one of the most important. But they're all important. The anti-cynicism pill, all of those, managing impulsivity, all those things are extremely important every day. And that's the point. The point is, it's not as if we've mastered them all and we're telling the sophomores that they've got to start on the process. Every single one of us looks at these 16 traits and says, oh my goodness, I need some work in some of those areas. And I feel the same way. I think the worst mistake I could make is just to tell you about developing your habits of the mind and not working on it myself. I think we all have work to do. And for me, I'm an incessant optimist in the sense that I just believe in the improvability of human beings and the human condition. That's why I keep showing you that John Sloan Dickey comment all the time. And that's what you're here for, and that's what we're here to help you do. Yeah.
Optimism has to be a really important habit.
Well, let me go further, Carol. I would say this. One of the discussions I had with Tracy Kidder Tracy kept saying, you guys are so optimistic, and every piece of evidence suggests that you should be pessimistic. People are poor, people are dying of hunger, and yet you guys are optimistic about what you can do. One of the things I said to him, and I don't know quite how it fits in, but it rang true to me at the time and it rings true to me now, and I just sort of said it to him, was that, when you're dealing with really terrible situations with the poorest people on the planet, optimism is not the result of rational decision making. Optimism is a moral choice. Because if you're in a place like Haiti and everything's falling down around you and you choose to be pessimistic, outcomes will be very bad for the people you work with. Now, it's not to say that you should be wildly optimistic without being critical. The Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci used to talk about a pessimism of the intellect, but an optimism of the spirit. So that's precisely the combination that I think you need at a place like Dartmouth College. It's not hard, though, I tell you, to be optimistic when you get to hang out with Dartmouth students every day. I mean, you guys are a constant source of optimism for me. Yeah.
So they're starting to come in pretty fast here.
Sure.
So here we go. What responsible risks should we as students be taking?
Well, the most important risk, I think, is to really put yourselves outside your comfort zone. And, one of the things that I was talking about just today with Professor Heatherton is that sometimes, of the four qualities, the third one is the ability to understand threat. And sometimes students, that quality is heightened overly. You think that, if you have a bad hair day was the example, that everyone will notice. If you do something a little bit different from other people, that other people will notice. I think it's really important to do things like take courses outside of your comfort zone. One of the areas that I've been looking at with Brian Kennedy and Jeff James here in the Hopkins Center and Brian of the Hood Museum is the importance of the arts in developing intellectual capacity. When I looked at that information, I was blown away. For example, learning to play the piano when you're 4 is correlated with being better at conflict resolution when you're 6. There are parts of your brain that light up simultaneously when you're listening to music that don't light up simultaneously in other situations. So there's something about the arts that's really important. Now, for me, one of the things that I've been intending to do, and I'm still intending to do it, is to begin exploring music and art more myself personally. I never did. I thought that the ability to draw was a fixed trait. I'll tell you, I thought that up until last year, when I saw people who were in a writing class, in a drawing class, for the very first time, doing beautiful work. So, for the sake of your mind, take the kinds of risks that put you into uncomfortable areas, that put you into areas that really make you, and you can almost feel your neurons being remade. Those are great risks. Taking risks that just seem to be exhilarating, especially under the influence of alcohol, I'd say avoid those risks. Yeah.
Jim, related to what you just said, bringing out the things that you've been thinking about the arts, somebody writes, how do you think the humanities will be important in developing habits of the mind?
Well, one of the things that I thought about is what if we were to study the evolution of empathy during the process of, say, taking a course in literature? I mean, so much of literature is about human empathy. So much of literature is about getting deeply into the mindsets of these characters, so that I think that it happens every day in the humanities, that developing those habits of the mind are critical. We just had a discussion today. Wynn Thompson's here from the American University of Kuwait, and I was telling him that there are universities in Korea that have eliminated their humanities because they think they need to focus on training the technocrats of the future. And in my discussions with Korean leaders, I've said that that's exactly the opposite of what they want to do. That where Korea is now economically is that they've got to start being creative. They're not going to make their future by copying other technologies and selling them more inexpensively. They now have to come up with the new ideas, the cultural production. And to me, studying the humanities and the arts is absolutely critical. So you can I think, map many of these traits, habits of the mind, on to the coursework that we're already doing, especially in the humanities and the arts, others as well, but especially, I think, in courses in the humanities.
Okay, here's a very serious one. Between now and 1994, what habits of the mind influenced or caused something to happen to your hair? Can't quite get that one.
If you can figure that one out, you have a very bright future in the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on for that. This is a serious one too. What do you believe the net effect of the Greek system is on our campus empathy muscles?
Yeah. You know, I'm not in the basements on Friday and Saturday nights. I don't know what happens there. I meet with members of the Greek system all the time, though, and I hear them talk to me about how deep the connections they make among the brothers and sisters in the Greek system. So I think it's mixed. I think we have to just be honest about it and say it's mixed. I think that the closeness that people feel to people you get to know so well, you know, from the beginning of your sophomore year really on, as fraternity and brothers and sorority sisters, is tremendous. And I think having those relationships for the rest of your life are really important. But I have then also heard, especially from women who've been in fraternity basements, who say that a lack of empathy and a lack of respect sometimes is part of what we see in those basements in the evening. And I would just invite all of the students to think about that as we go forward. You know, we make and remake our campus all the time. And what I can tell you is that instances when everyone knows that you are letting your empathy muscles go flabby are not good. What are we going to do to step in and change that formula? I don't know. I can't legislate it. I can't dictate to you what we're going to do. I can just tell you that if you let things happen that are obviously a choice not to exercise your empathy muscle, they're getting flabby, and that's going to hurt you in the future.
Jim, here's one. Is humor an important habit of the mind?
Oh, absolutely. Finding humor is one of the 16 habits of the mind. And I think it's really, really important. You know, one of the things that, I have to say, I get such a kick out of the humor that breaks out on campus. You know, the greatest comedians of all time are always said to be the most brilliant people. It takes a really great mind to find humor in ways that are compelling. So I think it's really important. I think also laughter is incredibly therapeutic. So finding humor is terribly important. Yeah.
There are quite a few here about how should we really think about implementing this on campus. And so people are asking things like, how do you imagine we can put this into action in our courses? Yeah. How can students who are so busy doing so many other things learn to add in a thoughtful way of adding habits of the mind? Or how can we actually support students in strengthening these habits? So what are your general thoughts about bringing
Carol,
this to campus?
I don't know, and I think you know much better than I. I'm not sure. But I know that our own faculty have a lot of great. Every time I've talked to faculty members about habits of the mind, I hear things like, oh, you know, we really work on this and this and this. And I'd never really thought of it in those terms, but isn't it interesting that we're finding the neurophysiological correlates of things that we're actually already doing? So I don't think that it's a question of saying we don't do any of this and we've got to start. That's not the point at all. The point is we do it. We do it every day. This is why we're the #1 undergraduate education in the United States. No applause for that. U.S. News and World Report gets it wrong all the time. With Dartmouth, this time they got it right, so we have to give them their due. Well, so the point is, we do it all the time, and I would argue that we already are developing habits of the mind better than anybody else. That's what I feel gives us our #1 ranking. But can we do it better? I think so. I think if we're intentional about it, I think, you know, letting you, as you go into general chemistry class, maybe we start, the first lecture is about this study and about how theory of the mind impacts the way you're going to do in chemistry class. I'm not sure what it is, but I have great faith that we'll figure it out. The strategic planning process we're going through right now is going to be partly focused on figuring out how to do it. I would like to tell the rest of the world that when you come to Dartmouth, not only do you get the #1 undergraduate education, not only do you learn everything from Shakespeare to physics, but we're also every day thinking about how to instill in our young people habits of the mind that we know to be important for anything that they want to do going forward.
So I'm going to ask two more. And then I'm also going to encourage people to keep sending in questions, because these will really help us as we go forward and think about incorporating habits of the mind in curriculum and other conversations. So don't stop sending them. But here's a question about another John, not John Sloan Dickey, but this time it's John Ledyard. Let me just see. It says, what do you think John Ledyard would do if you told him he could not swim in the river? But you don't have to answer that exactly.
So let me tell you exactly what I think. I didn't know John Ledyard. I heard he was a great guy. But this is all about using both your prefrontal cortex and trying to keep it in check as you think about things like the Connecticut River. Look, I've said to you many, many times, I can't legislate behavior. But what we did was we did a very rigorous study. I called Jim Wright. I talked to Jim Wright about this. We did a very rigorous study of what happens in the Connecticut River. And here's what we found out. One, the current of the Connecticut River changes all the time and from second to second, because as they open and close the docks. Two, there is debris in the Connecticut River that flows past at very unpredictable times, especially at times when they open and close the docks. The water off the edge of the Connecticut River is murky and very deep. Having lifeguards, this was what we were told, having lifeguards on the deck is really an illusion, because if you go down, we can't find you, especially if the river's flowing. So the choice that we had to make was, do we put lifeguards out there and pretend as if we can save people if something bad happens? Or do we make a statement? And again, as a public health person, I've got to listen to experts and listen to the research. Or just be honest with you and say, look, it's not safe to swim there. Right? You don't know when the docks are going to be open and closed. You don't know when debris is going to fall down. And if you're swimming underwater and something hits you, we can't save you. Now, what I also said, though, was I understand very much the desire to swim in the Connecticut. I understand that. So we're starting a process now, and what I told our team was, let's look everywhere. I mean, what about landlocked countries in Europe? They must have figured out some way of making rivers safe to swim in. So what I can promise you is that for next year, we're going to scour the globe to try to find some way to make it safe so that you can swim in the Connecticut River. But, maybe this is the downside of having a doctor and a public health person as your president. I look at the data, and then I have to make a judgment based on whether I think it's safe for you. And the judgment, in our view, was absolutely overwhelming. We couldn't put a system out there pretending it was safe when we knew it wasn't. That's the answer to that question. Sorry about that. And it's hard to find humor in that, I'll tell you.
I'm going to end with one that is a really wonderful question. Do you think Hanover is a bubble? I sometimes have trouble thinking about the world's troubles as my own because I feel I'm not connected in the world.
Yeah. So that's your task. Hanover is not a bubble. It doesn't have to be a bubble. I think when I talk to people about what was the greatest thing about the Great Issues class, you all know that this is part of our effort to reinvigorate the Great Issues class. Most people say to me, well, it taught us about bias in the media. Now, back in those days, very few newspapers came to Hanover, and so one of the projects for people in the Great Issues class was to follow an issue over the course of the year. They read the Daily Worker, they read the New York Times, and they read the Chicago Tribune. Chicago Tribune was conservative, Daily Worker, of course, was very liberal, and New York Times was somewhere in the middle. And I'm told again and again by alums that bias in the media was a great lesson for Great Issues. Now, I don't think that's something that is unknown to students today. Students today have access to so much information all over the world, up to the minute, YouTube videos. I think there is the sense that there are just a lot of different perspectives and you don't quite know which one is true or not true. I think students have that already. But then that's the separate question. You're not living in a bubble in the sense that you have access to the outside world all the time. But what do we do with it? How do we make use of that? Getting out of here, having different kinds of experiences is really important. But every day right here, we can demonstrate that we're not living in a bubble. In Haiti, they know about Dartmouth. Dartmouth students raise more money for Haiti relief than any other group of students in the country. We've had... You know, our doctors and nurses were on the ground within 72 hours after the earthquake. It took other organizations weeks to get set up. So we reached out from the bubble with an act of compassion that is remembered to this day by those in Haiti and other people who watched. So it's not a bubble because of physical location anymore. It's a choice that we make of whether sitting here in Hanover, New Hampshire, with all the great things that we have, whether we allow it to be a bubble or not. So I think it's up to us.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.